Hi, I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitch and Tree Quilts, and I'm going to show you my method for hand stitching a binding on a quilt. I like to put that personal touch on every quilt that I do, whether it's a quilt for a shop sample that we have like this, quilt for a little table runner with an odd angle here at this corner, or even a charity quilt. Every quilt that I create, I like to hand stitch that binding on so it has a nice tight finish on the back that looks good, and it also has that special touch that when I'm giving this quilt to somebody else, they know that I've taken the time to hand stitch my binding on. So let's take a look at our supplies. All you need when you're binding your quilt is your quilt with the binding attached to the front, thread to match, and a needle. And the truth is your thread doesn't need to match. A lot of people like to have matchy-matchy thread, but if you sew your binding on correctly, you'll never see the thread. In addition to that, I'll take a pair of small snipping scissors that I might use to snip my thread. It's not necessary to have any sort of pins or any clips to clip your binding in place because you'll be using your hand to hold your binding in place. That way you don't have any additional expense, and also if you use pins to pin your binding in place, you run the risk of catching a pin with your finger and then bleeding on your quilt. Let's start by threading the needle. One of the things to keep in mind is that thread, when it is spun onto a spool, that the thread itself, when it's constructed, is constructed with a certain spin to the thread because it's got more than one ply. And as it sits on the spool, it's the same direction that it should go through your quilt, just like when it's on your sewing machine. When it's on your sewing machine, it comes off the spool and it goes through your machine this direction. The same is true for the quilt. What we often do is we often will pull out a length of thread, cut the thread, and then take the end that we just cut off and put that through our needle. When we do it that way, we're actually asking the thread to go through our quilt in the opposite direction that it was spun onto the spool. And that will create a tension on the thread and might cause it to fray or shred. So if you have a problem with your thread fraying or shredding, you might try just putting it through your needle the way that it wants to come off the spool. The way that I ensure that I'm threading my needle or the thread is going the correct direction is I'll pull a small part of the thread off the spool and I'll thread my needle. And so this is the direction that I want the thread to come off of my needle. So I'll go ahead and I'll pull off a section of the thread. And then I'll go ahead and get a length of thread off of my spool, clip it, and I'll tie the knot right here. So I'll go ahead and I'll knot my thread right there, and now I know that my thread going through my quilt will be going the right direction. So you can see I have a double length of thread up here at the top of the needle, and I have a single length of thread here at the bottom that ends with the knot. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to start real close to a corner of the quilt. You can start anywhere. It's not going to make a difference. The rule of thumb is that if you are a right-handed quilter, you're going to put your binding on with the quilt top facing up on your lap. If you are a left-handed quilter, you're going to put your binding on with the back of the quilt facing up on your lap. So as a right-handed quilter, I'm going to go ahead and get ready and show you how we would put this on. Here we go. We've got the right side of the quilt facing up on my lap. I'm going to lift the edge of the quilt. I've got it stitched on the front, and I'm going to bring it around to the back. So I do that, and I just hold it with my left hand. I'm going to be going from my right to my left. If I'm a left-handed quilter, I'll be doing the opposite, and I'll be going from my left to my right. So I'm going to fold it over just to make sure that I have my 1/4 inch, and I'm ready to sew my binding on. So to begin, here's my stitching line for stitching the binding onto the quilt. I'm going to take my needle, and on the outside edge of the quilt, I'm going to put the needle underneath that stitching line and bring it up just on the inside of that stitching line. I'll pull that through, and that will bury my knot in the quilt. You can see there's my knot, and that will bury my knot in the quilt. Now I'm ready to go ahead and start my binding. I'm going to fold my binding over, and here's my thread. I'm going to bring that thread up just on the very tip of the edge of that binding. I'll go through both layers of that. Again, I'll show you just through that very tip of that edge, and I'll go ahead and I'll pull that tight. Now I'm ready to stitch down the edge of that binding. I use my finger on the back side of the quilt, or the front is what it actually is, but it's the back as I'm holding it. And I'll put my needle in through the quilt top, just inside that stitching line. There's the stitching line, and just underneath the edge of the binding. I'll put my needle in there. I'm using my finger to give a little bit of bend to that. And I can bring my needle up right through the edge of that binding, again, just on the very edge of that, and I can pull that stitch taut. And now you can see that you can't even see that stitch. It's hidden because it's buried in the quilt. By burying that stitch in the quilt and not in the binding itself, it gives more strength and stability. A lot of quilters, when they're hand stitching on, will bury their stitches in the channel of the binding and just catch a little bit of the quilt. And what happens when you do that is, if the quilt is laundered, or if it's on the clothesline to dry, or if it's being tugged around by children, or just being used quite a bit, that can actually end up coming loose from the quilt, and the stitch that remained in the binding just comes loose. So if you've ever had a quilt where the binding comes loose, that's probably what's happened. By burying those stitches in the actual quilt itself, again, I've just got a little bit of bend to it there. I come up with that slight 1/4 inch. By burying those stitches in the quilt and coming up through the tip of the edge of the binding, I'm giving my quilt some strength and stability. The other thing I like to do is I like to actually do about 3, 4, sometimes 5 stitches before I pull my thread all the way through. By doing that, I save a lot of time in my hand stitching. I typically can hand stitch a queen size quilt in about 2 hours. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to the corner so that you can see how I handle a corner. Again, I'm holding the binding with the left hand. I'm stitching with my right hand. I have my finger underneath the binding so I can feel that if I've taken my needle all the way through, I can feel that with my finger. I do about 4 or 5 stitches, a scant 1/4 inch apart, pull my thread through, and I'm getting close to that corner. Burying these stitches in the quilt, not in the binding. And now I'm to my corner. So what I do is I'll finger press that corner to make sure that I have a nice 45-degree angle there with my binding. If I have threads in my corner from stitching my binding on, I make sure I have those trimmed off. So I finger pressed my corner, and I'll fold that over. You see I have a nice 45-degree angle there. I'll come up through the binding that's on the right-hand side that I just tacked down, and I'll bring that needle up right through the corner of the binding that, as I would turn the corner, it'll be on my left. Now when I bury my stitches, I'm burying them in my binding that I just tacked down on the right, and I'm coming up through that 45-degree angle corner that's on my left. I'll take 1, 2 stitches and pull my thread through, and now I'm going to come back down through that binding on my right and come out right at the corner. So now those stitches are buried all the way through. Now if this was a quilt that was going to a quilt show, I would go ahead and pass my needle through to the other side, and I'd tack down this side as well. You can come up through that edge now, and I can continue to go down the left side of my quilt. just as I did on the right side. Again, I'm using my left hand to hold the binding in place. No pins or clips are necessary. I'm using my finger, my index finger, to give a little bit of bend to that so that my needle is easy to bring up at the 1/4 inch mark. And I'm pulling my threads through after 3, 4, or 5 stitches. If I'm running out of thread, I simply take my needle, go through the quilt back, and up through the edge of the binding. I do 1 stitch, the second stitch in the exact same location. I make a loop of the thread, pass the needle through the loop once, twice, and by doing that, when I pull, I'm making a knot on my thread right there. Then, when I get a new piece of thread, I make a knot at the bottom. I come back in right in front of my knot that I created at the bottom of the quilt. I come up behind the binding, and I come out a scant 1/4 inch from the edge. That allows me to bury my knot inside that binding so nobody will ever see that. And I'm ready to go ahead and take those scant 1/4 inch stitches through the backing and up into the binding. Continue to go all the way around the quilt, and before you know it, your binding will be hand stitched. So now you're ready to go to hand stitch your bindings. You can see that that was a very quick method, but yet it's a very neat and tidy method, and it's a way to put that personal touch on every quilt that you finish. Thank you for joining us today.